I'll begin. I'd like to ask you, with regard to the war in Afghanistan, it has been dubbed the good war, usually in contrast to the war in Iraq. But I know you have an alternative view of what the war in Afghanistan was. So I would like to hear your thoughts about the justification for going into Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks.
It's a very interesting question. So let's go back 20 years. 9/11. It's important to recognize first that the United States didn't know who was responsible for 9/11. In fact, 8 months later, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, had his first major press conference. This is 8 months after. He was asked, of course, who was responsible for 9/11. This is now after the most intensive investigation, multinational investigation, probably in human history. He said, we presume that the perpetrators were Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but we haven't been able to establish it. That's 8 months after the invasion. Okay, let's go back to the invasion itself. So what was the motivation for it? Well, actually, I think the best answer to this was given by the leading figure in the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, Abdul Khalq, highly respected Afghan leader leading the resistance to the Taliban from within. He had an interview in October, right after the bombing started, with a leading Central Asia scholar, Anatol Lievin, and Lievin asked him, what do you think about the invasion? He said, the invasion will kill many Afghans. It will undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban regime from within. And he laid out those efforts. He thought they were promising. This will undermine them. But the Americans don't care about the Afghans, and they don't care about overthrowing the Taliban. What they want to do is show their muscle and intimidate everyone in the world. Well, that was pretty well, it was pretty much repeated by, in different words, by the American Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who was one of the main agents of the invasion. The Taliban very quickly offered to surrender. They would just go back to their villages and just be left alone. The United States could take over, of course, could then have Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in their hands. Rumsfeld's response to this offer was, we do not negotiate surrenders. It was then seconded by the president, George W. Bush, who said, same thing, we don't negotiate surrenders. We just use force. He was asked questions about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. He said, I don't know anything about them. We don't really care about them. We have bigger game in mind. The bigger game in mind was, of course, outlined explicitly, publicly, not secret. They want to go after Iraq. That's a real prize. Afghanistan is nothing. Go after Iraq, major prize, and then use that as a base for going on to other countries in the region, which were spelled out. That was the plan. So invading Afghanistan, in fact, if the United States had wanted to capture bin Laden, who was then a suspect, remember, not guilty, wouldn't have been very difficult. Could have done it with a small police action, which probably would have been supported by the Taliban. And they would have been happy to get rid of him. It was a nuisance for them. They couldn't just throw him out because of tribal rules. You don't throw out somebody who's taken refuge. That's important for the Pashtun conception of proper behavior. but they wouldn't have offered any opposition if the US wanted to send in a police action. That's no good. We have to show our muscle and intimidate everyone. Well, then what happened after that is Taliban went back to their villages. They're Afghans, after all. The United States came in, allies came in. At first, there are very good reporters who have been following this on the ground from the beginning. The best is Anand Gupta, written several books, has a recent article about it in the New Yorker repeating it. He said what others have reported the same things. A report in the Washington Post today saying basically the same thing from another one of the few reporters who was actually in the rural areas. That's where Afghanistan is. They all say the same thing. At the beginning, the Afghan rural population was relieved that the fighting the war is over. They can have some peace. And they had this idea, they didn't know much about the United States. The idea is that many people in the world have. Here's this super rich country which can do all kinds of good things for us. So they hoped that the United States would somehow come in and deal with their problems of poverty and so on. That didn't last very long. As soon as the US forces came in, they started attacking Afghans, started bombing them. You know, bomb could be aiming at, somebody called it, they thought was a Taliban, but it could hit a wedding party and kill 40 people. So you recruit a couple people for the Taliban, the relatives. Special forces break into people's houses during the night, humiliate them, take somebody out and send them to a torture chamber. You've created more Taliban. This continued to go on until you had a substantial resistance in the countryside. How did the US deal with it? Intensifying the violence, either itself or the Afghan army that it mobilized, which used the same tactics. But they say now, the same reporters, is everyone hated the Americans, including the Afghan army, for pretty good reasons. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The United States, when it came in, didn't know anything about Afghanistan. So they looked for people who could carry out their orders. Who were they? The warlords, the monsters who were running the place. They're the ones who have savvy. They can put themselves forth and saying, I'll work for you. But they're not stupid. One warlord could approach the Americans and say, in this village over here, there's some Taliban, namely one of his enemies. Then the Americans would come in and smash up that village and create more Taliban recruits. This went on through the 20 years. By the end, the British co-op pretty much the same in Helmand province. And by the end, there was a huge resistance, popular resistance. Actually, the Taliban originally were based in the Pashtun. It's the largest of the ethnic groups, but it's extended. One of the few surprises, very few surprises in the last few weeks, was that the warlords in the Tajik and Uzbek areas immediately moved to the Taliban. That was unexpected. Everything else was perfectly well expected. It was obvious that the government would collapse. The government is just a morass of corruption, which has no support. And the Afghan army, half of it was just on paper, ghost soldiers. Others were soldiers who didn't get paid, didn't have ammunition. The corrupt leaders and officials were stealing everything. They're not going to fight for the Americans. So they just disappeared. All of that was plain. I wrote about it in advance, others didn't. The only people who didn't seem to understand it were the people who had access to intelligence. Intelligence had a different story. That's one of the ways in which intelligence gets distorted. But if you looked at the facts on the ground, it was plain what was going to happen. The surprise was the joining the Taliban by their former enemies, the warlords in the Herat and Mazar al-Sharif and others. That was unexpected. So now it's apparently a multi-ethnic, rural-based organization. Well, what about the withdrawal? This goes back to President Trump. February 2020, Trump made a deal with the Taliban, didn't even bother to inform the Afghan government. They're nothing. Afghan people, of course, don't count at all. Made a deal with the Taliban and said American troops will withdraw in May 2021. Worst possible time, onset of the fighting season. No opportunity to accommodate, to make local arrangements. We'll pull out, and you can do anything you like. He imposed no conditions. Just said one condition: don't fire at American soldiers, which wouldn't look good for me, but anything else is your business. It's interesting to see the reaction of the Republican Party. It tells you something about US politics. Republican Party hailed this as a historic achievement by our great leader, President Trump. Take a look at their webpage. It was featured on their Republican Party webpage. And it stayed there up until the time when the debacle began. Actually, Biden slightly improved Trump's conditions. He delayed it a couple of months. There was a little more time. Added some conditions on the Taliban. So he carried out an improved version of what they were hailing as a marvelous historic achievement by the genius Trump. As soon as the debacle began, they pulled it off their webpage and turned to attacking the Democrats and the army for the disaster. You may have seen the Senate hearings where General Milley and others were called to account by Republicans who a month earlier were hailing the historic achievement, now denouncing the military for following what they had hailed. This carries shamelessness to a higher level, but that's the so-called Republican Party. It's not a political party anymore. Well, that's the basic story. Now comes the next stage. Now, there's a split in the so-called international community about how to deal with it. One approach is advocated by the China-based regional powers. It's basically the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, India, Pakistan. Their approach is to accommodate somehow with the Taliban regime. It's a miserable situation in Afghanistan. Masses of people are starving, the economy collapsed. So their approach is, well, let's give them some aid and support for the population and engage with them and make an effort to make their government more inclusive, less repressive, and shift the economy from opium production to export of minerals and their other resources. That's one approach. There's another approach, which is led by the United States and includes India, US ally. In the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India opposed this, preferred the US approach, which is to deprive Afghans of any aid and assistance, to hold their resources, treasury resources, happen to be in US banks, pressure the IMF and the World Bank not to offer them assistance, just punish the Afghans as much as possible. This doesn't punish the leadership. Sanctions, we have plenty of experience with sanctions. They hurt the population. They usually make the leader stronger. The population has to huddle under the leader's umbrella just to survive. happens over and over. The United States is the only country that can impose sanctions. Others go along sometime, but if they tried to do it on their own, nobody would pay the slightest attention. When the United States imposes sanctions, everyone has to obey, even if you oppose them. So take the sanctions against Cuba, the oldest ones. The entire world opposes them. The vote at the United Nations, last one, is 184 to 2. Israel goes along with the United States, client state has to. The rest of the world says no, but they all abide by the sanctions because US sanctions are third-party sanctions. They tell others, if you don't abide by them, we throw you out of the international financial system and you have other punishments. The world is basically the mafia, and the Godfather gives the orders, and others obey whether they like it or not. It's reality, not political science. So pretty much that's what's happening. So if the United States imposes sanctions, like it on Afghanistan, like it or not, the rest of the world will have to obey. Maybe not China. They won't. They're on their own. That's one of the reasons China's an enemy. They don't just follow orders. It's not tolerable. But maybe the Central Asian states will go along with China. In fact, they've been shifting. They've kicked out the American bases and are moving towards the China-based Eurasian system, the Belt and Roads, the investment system that China's been carrying out. So that seems to be the way it's developing.